My name is Cassidy Rhodes, and I am 30 years old. I have spent the last 8 years of my life climbing the corporate ladder to become the head of logistics for one of the largest global shipping firms in North America, a position that requires nerves of steel and the ability to manage millions of dollars in inventory across several continents at any given second. I am a woman who understands value, who understands the cost of labor, and who knows exactly how much sweat goes into every single dollar earned. Yet as I stood in the opulent, velvet-lined hallway of the Grand Majestic Hotel in downtown Chicago, I realized that the man I was about to marry didn't understand the first thing about what things actually cost. Your father smells like a basement and looks like a janitor. Table 1 was meant for investors, not the help, my fiancé, Brooks Sterling III whispered into my ear. His voice was as smooth and cold as the marble floor beneath us. He reached up with manicured fingers to adjust his $185 silk tie bar clip, ensuring it was perfectly centered on his custom-tailored charcoal suit. He didn't even look at me when he said it. He was too busy admiring his own reflection in the gold leaf mirror hanging on the floral-patterned wallpaper. I stood there, frozen, the weight of my $4,200 Vera Wang gown suddenly feeling like a lead suit designed to crush my ribs. The delicate lace and silk tulle, which had seemed so ethereal during the fittings, now felt like a shroud. Behind the heavy, hand-carved oak doors of the ballroom, the muffled roar of 220 guests sounded like a predatory beast. I could hear the rhythmic clinking of crystal glasses filled with Veuve Clicquot, a vintage that cost $85 a bottle and was currently being poured with reckless abandon by a staff that Brooks treated like furniture. We were 5 minutes away from the grand entrance, 5 minutes away from a lifetime of being tied to a man who thought a tie clip was worth more than a human being's soul. I looked down at the leather-bound seating chart resting on a mahogany easel next to the door. It was a masterpiece of calligraphy, etched in gold ink on heavy cream cardstock. My eyes blurred as I searched for the name Thomas Rhodes. My father. A man who had spent 25 years working 14-hour shifts at the BP Whiting refinery, coming home with grease under his fingernails and the scent of industrial chemicals clinging to his skin like a second shadow. He had worked those double shifts through birthdays and holidays and freezing Indiana winters, specifically so his daughter could go to a top-tier university and never have to worry about the price of a gallon of milk. He was the man who was paying for this $68,412 wedding. Every cent of the deposit for the Grand Majestic, every flower in the $9,000 floral arrangements, and every bite of the $150 per plate Wagyu beef had been earned through the physical destruction of his knees and back. And yet, as I followed the lines on the chart, I saw that his name had been scratched out from Table 1. A small, neat sticker had been placed over it, bearing the name of one of Brooks's venture capital partners from Greenwich. My father's name had been moved. I traced the numbers down, past the cousins, past the college friends, past the business associates, all the way to the very bottom of the list. Table 22. I knew exactly where that table was located. It was tucked into the far corner of the ballroom, right next to the heavy, swinging service entrance and the deafening roar of the industrial dishwasher that cycled every 12 minutes. It was the table for people the Sterlings wanted to hide. It was the table for the help. "Brooks," I said, my voice trembling but gaining strength with every heartbeat. "Why is my father at table 22? He didn't even turn his head. He was busy checking his $12,000 Rolex Submariner, his brow furrowed with mild annoyance. "Cassidy, don't be dramatic. Your father is a wonderful man, I'm sure, but he has nothing in common with the CEO of Blackstone or the partners at my firm. He'll be much more comfortable back there with people who speak his language." Besides, he's probably going to want to sneak out early to get back to his little house anyway. It's better for everyone. He spoke about my father as if he were a stray dog he had graciously allowed into the foyer, provided the dog stayed on the rug. I looked at Brooks, really looked at him for the first time in 3 years. I saw the way his nose turned up slightly, the way he looked at the world through a lens of inherited wealth and unearned arrogance. He was 32 years old, an analyst who had been handed a vice presidency because his father played golf with the right people at the Stanwich Club. He had never known the metallic taste of a long day's work or the deep, bone-aching fatigue of providing for a family. To him, the $185 tie clip was just a detail, a minor accessory. To my father, $185 was 2 days of dangerous labor in a refinery tower. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to how we got here. I met Brooks at a charity gala in Manhattan. At the time, I was dazzled by the Polish, the way he moved through a room like he owned the oxygen in it. Growing up in a house that smelled of sawjo and pine sol, I thought I wanted the life he offered. I thought I wanted the 4,000 square foot brownstone in Brooklyn and the summer weekends in the Hamptons. My parents were so proud. When I told my father I was marrying a sterling, he didn't care about the money. He just wanted to know if Brooks made me laugh. He took his entire retirement savings, the money he had meticulously squirreled away in a Vanguard 500 index fund, and told me he wanted me to have the wedding of my dreams. He told me his little girl deserved to be a princess for one night. Yesterday, during the rehearsal dinner at the signature room on the 95th floor of the Hancock Center, my father had tried to make a toast. He had stood up, wearing a suit he'd bought off the rack at Men's Warehouse, his hands shaking slightly as he held a piece of notebook paper. He started talking about how I used to help him clean the spark plugs on his old 1998 Ford F-150 when I was 6 years old. He spoke with such raw, unfiltered love that the room should have been moved to tears. Instead, I saw Brooks's mother, Eleanor, lean over and whisper something to her husband, both of them snickering into their silk napkins. They weren't listening to a father's love. They were mocking his grammar and his calloused hands. Standing in that hallway now, the air was thick with the scent of $400 an ounce perfume and the faint metallic tang of the hotel's polished brass. I could hear my father's laugh from behind the doors, a loud, boisterous sound that came from the belly. It was the only honest sound in that entire building. Brooks heard it too, and he winced. "See?" he muttered. "He's already making a scene." I should have told him the dress code was black tie only, but I figured he wouldn't know the difference between a tuxedo and a rental. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. This wasn't just about a seating chart. This was about the next 50 years of my life. If I walked through those doors, I was telling my father that his sacrifice didn't matter. I was telling the man who had quite literally built the foundation of my life that he wasn't good enough to sit at my table. I was choosing a $185 tie clip over a man who had given me everything. I felt a strange, cold calm wash over me. It was the same feeling I got when a major shipping lane was blocked and I had to reroute an entire fleet in minutes. It was the clarity of knowing exactly what had to be done. I reached behind my back, my fingers fumbling with the intricate silk-covered buttons of the Vera Wang gown. Brooks finally looked at me, his eyes widening. "Cassidy, what the hell are you doing? The coordinator is signaling us. We have to go." I didn't answer him. I kept unbuttoning. The lace gave way, the structure of the dress loosening. I felt the cool air of the hallway hit my skin. Underneath the $4,200 masterpiece, I was wearing a simple silk slip I'd put on for comfort. I stepped out of the heavy skirt, letting the ivory fabric pool on the floor like a dying swan. The $500 Jimmy Choo heels followed. I stood there in my bare feet, feeling the cold, hard reality of the marble beneath me. "Cassidy!" Brooks hissed, his face turning a mottled shade of purple. "You've lost your mind. Do you have any idea how much this room cost? Do you have any idea who is behind those doors? My father's partners, the press, the Sterlings. You are making a mockery of our name." "It's not your name, Brooks," I said, my voice as steady as a heartbeat. "It's my father's money. And since he's the one who paid for table 1, I think it's only fair that he gets to decide who sits there. But since you've already filled it with investors, I think I'll just take my father and go get some real food." I turned away from him, ignoring his frantic, whispered threats and the way he tried to grab my arm. I pushed open the heavy oak doors, not as a bride making a grand entrance, but as a daughter coming home. The room went silent. 220 pairs of eyes landed on me, the bride in a slip, barefoot, walking past the $9,000 flower walls and the shimmering ice sculptures. I didn't look at the Sterlings. I didn't look at the investors. I walked straight to the back of the room, past the glistening centerpieces of table 5, 10, and 15, until I reached the very edge of the kitchen's cacophony. There he was. My father, Thomas, sitting at a cramped table with the extra chairs, his large frame hunched over a glass of water. He looked up, his weathered face etched with confusion and then immediate, sharp concern. "Cassie? Honey, what's wrong? Did something happen to the dress?" He stood up instantly, his first instinct, as always, to protect me. I reached out and took his hand. His palm was rough, the skin thickened by decades of honest, grueling work. It felt like the safest place in the world. "Nothing is wrong, Dad," I said, loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear over the sound of the dishwasher. "I just realized I was at the wrong table, and I'm tired of being around people who don't know the value of a day's work." I looked back at the front of the room. Brooks was standing in the doorway, looking small and pathetic in his perfect suit and his $185 tie clip. He was a man who knew the price of everything and the value of nothing. I looked at the $68,412 spectacle and realized it was a small price to pay for my freedom. "Come on, Dad," I said, tugging on his hand. "There's a diner 3 blocks from here that makes the best cheeseburgers in Chicago, and I hear they don't care if you smell like a refinery." As we walked out of the Grand Majestic, leaving behind the Veuve Clicquot and the hollow promises of a life I never truly wanted, I felt the weight lift off my shoulders. The night air was crisp, smelling of rain and Lake Michigan. My father didn't ask questions. He just squeezed my hand, his stride steady beside mine. Family isn't the name on a seating chart or the brand of a suit you wear to impress strangers. Family is the person who works the double shift so you can dream, and the person who walks out of the party when they stop respecting the man who made the party possible. I am Cassidy Rhodes, and as I walked down the street in my silk slip and bare feet, I had never felt more like a queen. Brooks Holloway was a man built entirely out of carefully curated perceptions and the fragile scaffolding of what he called old money. Though, as the months went by, I began to realize that his pedigree was more of a performance than a reality. He moved through the world with an unearned confidence that only comes from never having had to worry about a utility bill, often glancing down at his $9,000 Breitling Navi timer with its complex circular slide rule and blue alligator strap, as if he were timing the very rotation of the Earth itself for his own personal convenience. He navigated the congested streets of the city in a 2024 Carrara white metallic Porsche Cayenne, a vehicle that looked the part of a high-powered executive's chariot, but was actually a leased liability that drained $1,240 from his bank account every single month, just to maintain the illusion of success. Brooks was the kind of person who could spend $400 on a single Saturday morning brunch at Soho House, ordering truffle-infused eggs and bottomless mimosas while discussing the fluctuating markets with an air of boredom, never once considering that the money he threw away on a 3-hour meal was equivalent to a full week of groceries for a struggling family. He looked at life as a series of premium experiences to be collected and displayed, whereas my father, Silas, looked at life as a series of foundations to be poured and reinforced for the sake of those he loved. My father was a man of quiet, rhythmic consistency who still laced up the same pair of mahogany-colored Red Wing boots he had purchased back in 2012, boots that had been resoled twice and bore the deep, dark creases of a decade spent on concrete and gravel. While Brooks was obsessing over the latest fashion trends and the prestige of a designer label, my father was living a life of extreme intentionality within the walls of his modest 1,100-square-foot bungalow on the outskirts of the city. A house that smelled of cedar shavings and the strong black coffee he brewed every morning at 4:30 a.m. Silas didn't care for the flash of a Breitling or the status of a German SUV. He was a man who lived by the clock of his $31.50 hourly wage, a rate he had earned through 25 years of loyalty and sweat at the refinery. Every single week, with the precision of a master logician, he would sit at his scarred oak kitchen table with a calculator and a ledger, moving every spare cent into a specific Vanguard brokerage account he had opened when I was just a toddler, a fund simply and heartbreakingly labeled Cassidy's Dream. The contrast between the two men was a chasm that grew wider every time I looked at them in the same room, a physical manifestation of the difference between inherited arrogance and earned dignity. Brooks would lean back in his chair, his hands manicured and soft, complaining about the 15% service charge at a luxury hotel, while my father would be sitting in his worn recliner, his knuckles swollen from years of manual labor, quietly calculating compound interest and tax implications to ensure he could cover the full 20% down payment on my future home as a wedding gift. It was a staggering sum, a life's work distilled into a single selfless gesture of love that Brooks couldn't possibly comprehend because he had never actually built anything in his life. Brooks saw money as a tool for social climbing and the acquisition of temporary status symbols that would inevitably be traded in for the next model. But my father saw money as a brick, something heavy and solid that could be used to build a wall of protection around his daughter, so she would never have to feel the biting wind of financial insecurity. I remember one specific evening when we were all forced into the same space for a pre-wedding dinner at an upscale steakhouse where the atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and aged leather. Brooks spent the better part of an hour lecturing my father on the benefits of diversifying into speculative crypto assets, his Breitling catching the light of the chandelier every time he gestured with his wine glass. My father just listened, his expression unreadable, his rough hands resting flat on the white linen tablecloth like two pieces of weathered driftwood. Silas didn't mention that he had already secured the future of my home, nor did he mention that he had accounted for every penny of the $68,412 wedding budget down to the last cent of the gratuity for the waitstaff. He let Brooks talk. He let him boast about the horsepower of the leased Porsche and the exclusive guest list at Soho House, because my father understood a truth that Brooks was too shallow to grasp, that the loudest person in the room is often the one with the most to hide, and the man with the oldest boots is often the one who has walked the furthest to ensure his family has a place to rest. As the wedding neared, the tension between these two worlds began to vibrate like a pulled wire. with Brooks constantly pushing for more extravagance, more flowers, a better vintage of champagne, a more prestigious venue, while my father simply nodded and wrote the checks from his savings. Brooks saw my father's bungalow and his Red Wing boots as signs of a lack of ambition, a failure to participate in the high-stakes game of societal optics, never realizing that my father was the most ambitious man I had ever known. His ambition wasn't for himself, it was for me, and it was measured in the quiet accumulation of security rather than the loud declaration of wealth. While Brooks was worried about how his investors would perceive the seating chart at the Grand Majestic Hotel, my father was worrying about whether the HVAC system in the house he wanted to help me buy would last another 10 years. Every time Brooks adjusted that $185 tie clip or checked the time on his $9,000 watch, I felt a knot tightening in my stomach, a realization that the man I was supposed to marry viewed my father as a janitor because he couldn't see past the grease on his skin to the gold in his heart. My father's $31.50 hourly wage was, to Brooks, a pittance not worth discussing, but to me, it was the sound of my college tuition being paid, the sound of every medical bill being covered, and the sound of a father telling his daughter that she was worth every single hour of his life. The 1,100-square-foot bungalow wasn't a small house to Silas. It was a fortress of discipline that allowed him to save enough to give me the world on a silver platter, even if that platter was hidden under the grime of a refinery worker's uniform. I watched as Brooks ordered another $150 bottle of wine, laughing at a joke I didn't find funny, and I looked at my father, who was checking his own modest Timex to make sure he wasn't late for his night shift. The disparity was suffocating. Brooks was a man of shadows and leases, a man who lived on the surface of life where everything is shiny and nothing is deep. My father was a man of substance and grit, a man who lived in the bedrock where things are heavy and permanent. The 20% down payment my father had meticulously saved for wasn't just a financial gift. It was a testament to a lifetime of sacrifice, a physical manifestation of every 14-hour shift and every freezing morning he had spent in those Red Wing boots. I realized then that Brooks didn't just dislike my father's appearance. He was threatened by the reality of him. He was threatened by a man who didn't need a Breitling to know his worth, and who didn't need a Porsche to feel powerful. My father's quiet dignity made Brooks's loud displays of wealth look like what they truly were, a desperate attempt to cover up a hollow center. As I sat between them, the bride-to-be caught in the middle of a war between authentic labor and synthetic status, I began to see the cracks in the facade of the life Brooks was offering me. A life with Brooks would be a life of $1,240 monthly payments on a dream that didn't belong to me, while a life honoring my father was a life built on the solid ground of the Vanguard account and the 1,100-square-foot bungalow where love was the only currency that mattered. The weight of the $4,200 Vera Wang dress I would eventually wear felt heavier every time I thought about the $31.50 an hour it took to buy it. I began to count the hours of my father's life in my head. How many hours at the refinery for the lace? How many hours for the silk? How many hours for the memories that Brooks wanted to bury at table 22? It was a mathematical equation of heartbreak. My father was trading his time, the most precious thing he had, for a celebration that the groom was already planning to ruin with his elitism. Brooks wanted the investors at Table 1 because they represented the future he wanted to climb toward. But he wanted my father at Table 22 because he represented the past he was ashamed of. He didn't understand that Table 22 was the only table in that entire ballroom that was actually paid for with honest money, and that the man in the Red Wing boots was the only one in the room who truly belonged at the head of it. As I looked at the seating chart in the hallway of the hotel, those numbers, Table 1 and Table 22, became more than just locations. They became a final exam for my soul. Brooks stood there in his perfection, his Breitling ticking away the seconds toward a wedding that was built on my father's bones, and I realized that I couldn't walk down that aisle. I couldn't look at the man who saved every cent of his $31.50 wage and tell him that he wasn't good enough to sit in the front row of the life he had built for me. The $400 brunches and the $1,240 car payments were the chains Brooks wanted to put on me, but the 1,100-square-foot bungalow and the Red Wing boots were the wings my father had given me to fly away from people like Brooks. By the end of that night, the shimmering lights of the Grand Majestic would fade, and the guest list would be nothing more than a piece of discarded paper. But the reality of who these men were would remain. Brooks would still be a man chasing a shadow of wealth he didn't own, and Silas would still be the man who loved me enough to give me everything he had, even when the world told him he was just the help. I made my choice in the silence of that hallway, a choice to reject the lease and embrace the legacy, to leave the Breitling behind and follow the footprints of the boots that had never let me down. The betrayal reached its crushing climax at exactly 5:45 p.m., a sharp and unforgiving moment in time that remains etched into my memory like a scar, occurring just 15 minutes before we were scheduled to make our grand entrance into the ballroom. I found my father, Silas, standing alone by the heavy, double-hinged kitchen doors, the stainless steel of the industrial prep area clashing violently with the gilded luxury of the hallway. He was holding a crumpled cream-colored place card in his calloused hands, his thumb tracing the elegant gold calligraphy of his own name, as if he were trying to make sense of a language he no longer understood. Standing before him was Brooks' mother, Eleanor Holloway, a woman who moved through the world as if the very air were a luxury she had personally patented. She was dressed in a $3,000 Oscar de la Renta suit in a shade of pale champagne that matched her cold, detached eyes, and she didn't even bother to look my father in the eye as she delivered her verdict. The seating was adjusted for the flow of the room, Cassidy, she told me when I approached, her voice smelling of expensive, breath-freshening mints and a deep, ingrained condescension that suggested she was doing us a favor by even explaining herself. She spoke with a practiced, tonal flatline, her posture perfect, her diamond earrings catching the harsh fluorescent light leaking out from the kitchen. I looked from her polished face to my father, and my heart broke into 1,000 jagged pieces. Silas looked smaller than I'd ever seen him in his entire life, his shoulders slightly hunched in a suit that, while clean and pressed, could never compete with the bespoke tailoring surrounding us. He smelled faintly of the peppermint oil he used to soothe the chronic joint pain in his hands and knees, a physical tax he paid every day for 25 years of refinery labor, a scent that I had always associated with comfort and safety, but which now felt like a badge of the working class that Eleanor was desperate to hide. Behind him, the chaotic energy of the service staff was reaching a fever pitch as waiters in black vests rushed past him with silver trays laden with $12 per piece appetizers, the miniature duck confit tarts and seared scallops nearly knocking him over as they navigated the narrow corridor. He was an obstacle to them, a ghost in the machine of a high society event, and Eleanor looked at him with the same mild irritation one might reserve for a smudge on a window pane. She had replaced my father at table 1 with 3 of Brooks' former frat brothers from Yale, boys who had spent their afternoon drinking expensive bourbon in the hotel bar and who were currently laughing loudly somewhere inside, their presence deemed more essential to the flow of the room than the man who had actually financed the entire evening. My father's presence at the head table was a variable Eleanor had decided to eliminate to ensure the aesthetic and social purity of her son's wedding. And she did it with the clinical precision of a surgeon removing a benign but unsightly growth. I watched as a young server, balance testing a tray of crystal flutes, brushed against my father's arm, causing him to stumble slightly against the wood paneling. He didn't complain. He just looked down at that crumpled card, his face a mask of quiet, dignified hurt that was more painful to witness than any scream could have been. The sheer, calculated cruelty of the moment was suffocating. The contrast between Eleanor's $3,000 suit and my father's peppermint oil creating a rift that no amount of wedding lace could bridge. I realized that to the Holloways, my father wasn't the man who had worked 14-hour shifts to pay the $68,412 bill for this night. He was just the help who had overstayed his welcome in the foyer. Eleanor's comment about the flow of the room was a thinly veiled euphemism for social cleansing, an admission that my father's rough hands and honest scent were a disruption to the fantasy of old money they were trying to project. I stood there in my $4,200 gown, the silk feeling like ice against my skin, and I felt a tectonic shift in my own identity. I looked at Eleanor, who was now checking her reflection in a compact mirror, and then I looked at my father, who was quietly trying to step out of the way of another waiter. The industrial dishwasher behind the kitchen doors hissed and groaned, a mechanical reminder of the world my father came from, a world of gears and steam and hard-won wages. Every $12 appetizer that swept past us represented nearly half an hour of my father's life at the refinery, yet he was being pushed aside to make room for people who had never earned a single dollar of their own. Now let me take you back to the countless nights I saw my father come home, his face gray with fatigue, his Red Wing boots caked in the dust of the Whiting refinery, all so I could stand in a hallway like this. He had traded his health and his youth for my mobility, and the Holloway family was treating that sacrifice as if it were a social embarrassment. Eleanor's condescension wasn't just an insult to my father, it was an assault on the very concept of merit and hard work. She stood there, the gatekeeper of a world built on credit and leases, looking down on the man who was the only person in the building with a positive balance in his soul. The waiters continued their frantic dance, the smell of seared beef and high-end catering filling the air, while the subtle medicinal scent of peppermint oil remained the only honest thing in my nostrils. I realized that the grand entrance Brooks was so excited about was a lie, a performance designed to celebrate a union between a woman who had forgotten her roots and a man who had never had any. I reached out and took the place card from my father's hand, feeling the heat of his skin, and I saw that he was shaking, not from anger, but from the sheer, crushing weight of being told he didn't belong at his own daughter's side. Eleanor finally looked at me, a sharp, questioning glance. "Cassidy, we really must get into position. The Herald is waiting to announce the wedding party, and we cannot have the schedule slipping because of a seating misunderstanding." She said the word misunderstanding with a bite, as if it were my father's fault for not knowing his place. I looked at her, and then I looked at the 3 Yale boys through the crack in the door, who were probably discussing their father's hedge funds while drinking the champagne my father's sweat had purchased. The flow of the room was exactly what Eleanor wanted it to be, a stream of unearned privilege that left no room for the man in the 2012 Red Wing boots. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because in that moment, at 5:45 p.m., with the industrial dishwasher screaming in the background and the $12 scallops flying past us, I didn't just see a seating chart. I saw the map of my future if I stayed with Brooks. I would be expected to adjust the flow of my own life, until there was no room left for the people who actually loved me. I would be expected to trade peppermint oil for $400 an ounce perfume and to look at my own father through the same cold, champagne-colored lens as Eleanor Holloway. I watched as my father tried to offer a small, apologetic smile to Eleanor, as if he were sorry for being in her way. And that was the final straw. The man who had guarded my life for 30 years was now apologizing to a woman who wouldn't be able to survive a single hour in the refinery towers he had mastered. The injustice of it was a physical weight, a pressure in my chest that made it hard to breathe. The grand, majestic hotel, with all its crystal and velvet, suddenly felt like a prison, and the Vera Wang gown was the uniform of my incarceration. As the clock ticked toward 5:46 p.m., I realized that I didn't want to be part of their flow. I didn't want a life where my father was an adjustment to be hidden near the service entrance. I took a deep breath, the scent of peppermint oil giving me more strength than the Veuve Clicquot ever could, and I looked Eleanor Holloway straight in the eye for the first time that evening. I saw the flicker of surprise in her gaze, the realization that the logistics manager she had tried to cow was finally beginning to calculate the true cost of this merger. The betrayal wasn't just about a table, it was about the erasure of a life's work. It was about the fact that $68,412 wasn't enough to buy respect from people who didn't know how to give it. My father was the help in their eyes, despite being the benefactor of the entire event. As the waiters nearly knocked him over again and the sounds of the industrial kitchen roared behind us, I knew that the grand entrance at 6 p.m. would not be the one they were expecting. I was done with the adjustments, I was done with the flow, and I was certainly done with the Holloway family's definition of what a father should look like. The $3,000 suit Eleanor wore was just a shell, a hollow casing for a heart that couldn't comprehend the value of a man like Silas. She was worried about the guests' view of the room, while I was finally starting to see the room for exactly what it was. A stage for a play I no longer wanted to act in. I gripped my father's hand, the roughness of his skin a grounding wire for my escalating fury, and I prepared to make the only adjustment that actually mattered. The grand entrance was coming, but the story was about to change in a way that Eleanor and her Yale-educated son could never have predicted in their wildest, most privileged dreams. The heavy brass lock clicked into place with a definitive, echoing thud as I retreated into the sanctuary of the bridal suite, a room draped in excessive ivory silk and gilded mirrors that felt more like a beautifully appointed cell than a place of celebration. I sat on the very edge of the deep navy velvet sofa, my $4,200 Vera Wang gown fanning out around me in a chaotic sea of tulle and lace that suddenly looked like wasted effort and stolen time. I stayed there for exactly 12 minutes, a period of silence so profound that I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the antique clock on the mantel and the distant, muffled thumping of a bass line from the ballroom where the band was testing the sound system for a party that was quickly losing its guest of honor. My breath hitched in the back of my throat as I reached into the hidden pocket of my dress, a custom edition I had insisted on for my logistics work, and pulled out my titanium black iPhone 15 Pro, the cold metal of the device feeling grounded and honest against my palm. My thumb moved with a practiced, clinical speed as I bypassed the frantic notifications from Brooks and his mother, opening my banking application with a biometric scan that felt like a bridge back to the real world where numbers didn't lie and emotions were secondary to balance sheets. I navigated to the joint wedding account we had opened 6 months ago, a digital ledger that was supposed to represent our partnership and our shared future. But as the screen refreshed, the reality of my situation was laid bare in harsh, glowing pixels. Brooks' financial contribution to this entire theatrical production was exactly $0.00, a hollow figure that stood in stark contrast to the grandiosity of his demands and the arrogance of his family. I scrolled through his personal accounts, which I still had access to from our mortgage pre-approval process, and saw the wreckage of a man living far beyond his means. Despite earning a $120,000 annual salary as a senior analyst, every single cent of his income had been siphoned away into a black hole of status symbols. There were monthly payments of $1,240 for the leased Porsche Cayenne, $500 monthly dues for the Union League Club, and a staggering array of charges from high-end clothiers and cocktail bars that catered to the ego rather than the soul. Brooks wasn't a man of means. He was a man of appearances, a hollow vessel kept afloat by the sheer force of his own pretension and the credit lines he treated like an inheritance. Then, I swiped over to the records of the primary wedding account and saw the singular, monumental transaction that had made this evening possible. A wire transfer for exactly $68,412.30, sent from a humble savings account at a local credit union in Indiana. My father, Silas Rhodes, had written that check, a sum that represented every hour of overtime, every missed holiday, and every drop of sweat he had shed at the refinery for over 2 decades. He hadn't asked for a budget. He hadn't asked for a seat at the head table, and he certainly hadn't asked for the $185 silk tie clip that Brooks wore like a badge of superiority. He had simply given me his life's work in the form of a check because he believed his daughter deserved to be happy. The math of the situation was devastatingly simple and utterly undeniable, a cold equation where the value of a man's character was inversely proportional to the cost of his watch. While Brooks spent his $120,000 salary on memberships to clubs that would never truly accept him, my father had spent his $31.50 hourly wage on a dream that wasn't even his own. I exited the banking app, my hands trembling slightly as the full weight of the betrayal settled into my bones, and I opened my photo gallery, scrolling past the staged engagement shoots and the pictures of flower arrangements until I found the one image that truly mattered. It was a grainy, candid shot taken 25 years ago on the back porch of our old house in Hammond, showing my father's massive, grease-stained and calloused hands gently holding my tiny 5-year-old hand as he taught me how to use a basic wrench. In that photo, his skin was dark with the honest grime of a day's work, his fingernails chipped and worn, but the grip he had on me was the most secure foundation I had ever known. Looking at that photo while wearing a dress that cost more than my father made in 3 months of labor felt like a physical assault on my conscience. I realized in that quiet bridal suite that loyalty is not something that can be mapped out on a seating chart or bought with a leased luxury vehicle. It is a debt of the heart that must be paid in respect, in presence, and in the courage to stand up for the people who stood up for you when you were too small to reach the table. The 12 minutes I spent in that room were a metamorphosis, a stripping away of the illusions of high society and the hollow promises of the Holloway family. I looked at the 18-karat gold-rimmed mirror and didn't see a bride. I saw a woman who had almost traded a diamond for a piece of glass. I realized that the $68,412.30 wasn't just a wedding budget. It was my father's freedom, his retirement, and his dignity. And I was currently standing in the middle of a farce that was designed to make him feel invisible. Brooks' mother, Eleanor, with her $3,000 suit and her talk of the flow of the room, was an architect of a world where people like my father were treated as structural supports, necessary to hold up the building, but meant to be covered by plaster and paint so they wouldn't ruin the aesthetic. But as I stared at the photo of those calloused hands, I knew that the structural supports were the only part of the building that actually mattered when the storm hit. I stood up from the velvet sofa, the heavy fabric of the Vera Wang gown rustling like a warning, and I felt a surge of cold, logistical clarity. I had spent my career managing the movement of goods across the globe, ensuring that every container reached its destination and that every contract was honored. And yet I had almost allowed the most important contract of my life to be signed with a man who was morally bankrupt. The $120,000 salary that Brooks boasted about was a pittance compared to the wealth of spirit my father possessed, and the fact that Brooks had contributed $0 to our union was a prophetic indicator of how much he would contribute to our life together. He would be a passenger in his own marriage, a man who expected the world to be catered to him while he adjusted his tie clip in the mirror. I looked at my watch. It was nearly 5:58 p.m., and the grand entrance was only 2 minutes away. I could hear the muffled voice of the wedding coordinator through the door, her frantic tapping a reminder that the schedule was slipping. But I was no longer interested in their schedule. I was no longer interested in the $150 per plate Wagyu beef or the $85 bottles of Veuve Clicquot. I was interested in the man at table 22, the man who smelled of peppermint oil and refinery dust, the man who was currently being shoved aside by Yale graduates who had never done a day of real work in their lives. The debt of the heart I owed to Silas Rhodes was a debt I intended to pay in full, starting right now. I didn't need the 12 minutes to decide if I loved Brooks. I needed them to remember who I was. I was the daughter of a man who worked the night shift so I could have a better day. I was the product of grit and sacrifice, not leases and club memberships. I reached up and began the process of dismantling the bride, pulling the pins from my hair and feeling the weight of the veil slide off my head and onto the floor. The iPhone 15 Pro went back into my pocket, a tool of my trade, and now a witness to my liberation. I was done being a prop in the Holloway family's play. I was done allowing the man who paid for the theater to be treated like an usher. As I prepared to walk out of that suite, I didn't feel the fear that a bride should feel when she's about to blow up her own life. I felt the immense, soaring relief of a person who has finally looked at the math and realized they don't owe the world anything, but they owe their family everything. The grand entrance was going to happen, but it wouldn't be the one Eleanor Holloway had planned with such cold precision. It would be an entrance that honored the calloused hands and the 31.50 hourly wage. It would be an entrance that acknowledged that table 1 belongs to the person who built the table, not the person who just wants to sit at the head of it. I walked toward the door, my bare feet silent on the velvet, ready to walk away from the $0 man and back into the arms of the man who had given me the world. Every step I took away from that sofa was a step toward my own dignity, and as I reached for the handle, I knew that the next 12 minutes would change everything, not because of a wedding, but because of a daughter who finally remembered her father's name. I did not cry because tears are a luxury reserved for those who have no other way to negotiate their reality, and as the head of logistics for a global firm, I am a woman who deals in hard facts and immediate solutions. Instead of surrendering to the crushing weight of the humiliation Eleanor Holloway had tried to heap upon my father, I stood in that cold, ivory-walled bridal suite and became a strategist, moving with the calculated precision of a chess master who has just realized her opponent has been cheating. I reached for my iPhone 15 Pro and made 3 specific phone calls that would dismantle the Holloway facade brick by brick. The first call was to my personal attorney, Marcus Thorne, a man whose legal mind is as sharp as a scalpel and who answers his private line for $500 an hour, even on a Saturday evening when most of the city's elite are already at their second cocktail party. Marcus didn't ask for the emotional details. He simply listened to my rapid-fire instructions regarding the immediate termination of the prenuptial agreement and the freezing of the shared wedding account, his voice a low, steady hum of professional competence that provided the anchor I needed. My second call was to the Grand Majestic's banquet manager, a man named Mr. Henderson, who had spent the last 6 months ensuring that every one of Brooks's increasingly expensive whims was catered to with fawning attention. I didn't wait for him to find me. I moved through the quiet corridors of the hotel with the heavy skirts of my $4,200 Vera Wang gown gathered in one hand, my bare feet making a slapping sound against the cold, polished marble that felt more honest than the Jimmy Choos ever had. I met Henderson in the stark, fluorescent-lit service corridor, where the scent of bleach and industrial floor cleaner replaced the cloying perfume of the ballroom. He looked startled to see the bride alone in a service hallway, his eyes darting to my disheveled hair and bare feet, but I didn't give him a chance to ask questions. I reached into my pocket and handed him my American Express gold card, the metal cold and heavy between my fingers. I want the microphone in the ballroom live in exactly 5 minutes, and I want the final itemized bill for this entire event printed and in my hand right now, I told him, my voice devoid of any tremor. Henderson, sensing the tectonic shift in the evening's power dynamic, didn't hesitate. He swiped my card for the security deposit on the additional service fees and disappeared into a small, cramped office behind the kitchen. While I waited, I stood in that corridor, the very place where Eleanor had tried to hide my father, and I felt a sense of clarity that was almost blinding. I was done with the $120,000 a year salary of a man who owned nothing but a lease and a tie clip. I was done with the $3,000 suits of a woman who thought she could purchase the right to humiliate a man who had built her son's stage. 5 minutes felt like an eternity, but it was just enough time for Marcus Thorne to text me a confirmation of the legal freeze and for the high-speed laser printer in Henderson's office to finish churning out the 3-page document that would serve as the autopsy report for my relationship. Henderson returned, his expression now one of professional neutrality, and handed me the warm, freshly printed pages. I gripped them tightly, my eyes scanning the rows of numbers that detailed the absolute absurdity of the last few months. The bill was a masterpiece of corporate greed and personal vanity, totaling the $68,412.30 that my father had already paid in full. I saw the $1,200 floral arch that had been imported from Holland, a structure of white roses and orchids that was destined to wilt within hours. I saw the $85 per head salmon entree, a dish Brooks had insisted on because the chicken was too pedestrian for his Yale associates. There were line items for everything: the $9,000 floral budget, the $150 per plate Wagyu beef, the $5,000 open bar that was currently serving $85 bottles of Veuve Clicquot to people who didn't know the name of the man who had bought it. It was all there, printed in a clean sans-serif font that stripped away the romance and left only the cold, hard debt. This document was the map of my father's sacrifice, every dollar representing a minute he had spent in the heat of the refinery, every cent a testament to his belief that I deserved a seat at the world's most expensive tables. I looked at the third page, where the final total sat at the bottom like a judgment. Brooks had contributed $0, but his name was at the top of the invoice alongside mine, a leech on the legacy of a man he called the Help. I felt a surge of cold fury that my father's $31.50 hourly wage had been converted into this, into a party for people who laughed at his peppermint oil and mocked his Red Wing boots. I folded the 3-page bill and tucked it into the bodice of my gown, the paper feeling sharp and substantial against my skin. I didn't need the Jimmy Choos to feel tall. I didn't need the $4,200 dress to feel powerful. I had the truth, and I had the receipt to prove it. Henderson led me toward the hidden entrance behind the bandstand, his pace hurried as he checked his watch. The grand entrance was supposed to happen in 60 seconds. The music was already swelling, a triumphant orchestral piece that Brooks had chosen because it sounded like old money. I could hear the voice of the herald through the speakers, his tone booming and self-important as he prepared to announce the arrival of the new Mr. and Mrs. Sterling. But there would be no Mrs. Sterling tonight. I stood in the shadows of the velvet curtains, the scent of the $1,200 floral arch filling my lungs, and I saw Brooks standing at the main doors at the far end of the room. He was adjusting his $185 tie clip in the reflection of a silver tray, his face lit with the smug satisfaction of a man who believed he had successfully managed a merger. He didn't know that the logistics manager he was about to marry had already rerouted the entire ship. I looked down at the paper in my hand, the itemized bill that represented $68,412.30 of my father's life. Every single charge, from the overpriced salmon to the crystal glasses, was a debt I was about to collect. My father, Silas, was still at table 22, sitting quietly next to the service entrance, his head slightly bowed. He didn't know what I was about to do. He didn't know that I had spent 12 minutes in the bridal suite rediscovering the daughter he had raised. He just thought he was being a good father by staying out of the way of the flow of the room. I took a deep breath, the air in the ballroom feeling thin and artificial compared to the reality of the service corridor. I reached out and took the wireless microphone from the stand that Henderson had prepared, the device feeling heavy and live in my hand. Now, let me take you back to the day my father told me he had saved enough for the wedding. He had been so proud, his eyes shining as he handed me the Vanguard statement, his hands shaking slightly with the joy of being able to provide. He didn't see the $68,412 as a burden. He saw it as a gift. And I had almost let the Holloways turn that gift into a weapon to use against him. But as the herald took his breath to announce our names, I stepped out from behind the curtain, not into the arms of Brooks Sterling, but into the center of the spotlight that was meant for our first dance. The music faltered and then stopped abruptly as the feedback from the live microphone chirped through the room, silencing the clinking of crystal and the chatter of 220 guests. I looked across the expanse of the grand, majestic ballroom, past the $9,000 flowers and the $85 bottles of champagne, straight at table 22. My father looked up, his eyes widening as he saw his daughter standing alone, barefoot and holding a microphone. At the other end of the room, Brooks froze, his hand still on his tie clip, his expression one of confusion and growing alarm. Eleanor Holloway's champagne-colored suit seemed to drain of its light as she realized the schedule was no longer under her control. I felt the paper of the itemized bill crinkle against my chest, a reminder of the cost of everything in this room. The grand entrance was over, and the audit was about to begin. I didn't need to cry because I had something better than tears. I had the floor, I had the microphone, and I had the bill that showed exactly who had paid for every single person's seat in that room. The flow of the room was about to change forever, and for the first time in my 30 years, I was the one who was going to decide exactly where everyone sat. I stood there for a heartbeat, the silence of the ballroom so heavy you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. I saw the faces of the Yale frat brothers, the investors from Table 1, and the Sterlings in their $3,000 finery. I saw my father's rough hands resting on the white linen of table 22. I adjusted the microphone, the sound of my own breathing echoing through the speakers, and I prepared to read from the 3-page document that Henderson had printed. This wasn't a wedding anymore. It was an accounting. And before the night was through, every single person in the Grand Majestic would know the name of the man who had bought their dinner, and they would know the exact time and date that the Holloway illusion finally shattered. At exactly 6:15 p.m., the master of ceremonies, a man in a rented tuxedo who had been rehearsing his enthusiastic delivery for an hour, stepped into the golden pool of the spotlight and announced the grand entrance of the newlywed couple. The ambient lighting of the Grand Majestic ballroom dimmed to a romantic amber glow, leaving only the hundreds of flickering beeswax candles and the shimmering crystal chandeliers to illuminate the faces of 220 expectant guests. At the far end of the room, standing at the head table, the table that was supposed to be mine and was now occupied by Yale graduates and venture capitalists, Brooks Holloway stood tall, his chest puffed out under his custom-tailored charcoal suit, looking like a king surveying a kingdom he had never actually conquered. His mother, Eleanor, was beaming from her seat, her Oscar de la Renta suit glowing softly, her hands folded with the smug satisfaction of someone who had successfully curated the perfect social merger. But as the double doors at the side of the ballroom swung open, the triumphant orchestral music I had spent $2,500 to hire didn't play because I had personally signaled the sound technician to cut the feed. I walked out alone, moving across the thick, cream-colored Wilton carpet with a deliberate, heavy stride that lacked the airy grace of a bride and possessed the terrifying focus of a woman going to war. I wasn't smiling, and I wasn't looking for Brooks. I was wearing my $4,200 Vera Wang gown like a suit of tactical armor, the silk rustling with a metallic sharpness in the sudden, jarring silence of the room. In my right hand, I wasn't carrying a bouquet of imported lilies, but a stiff manila folder that felt heavier and more significant than any ring. Inside that folder were the printed bank statements from our joint account showing a $0 balance from the Holloway side, the Vanguard statements of a man who worked 31.50 an hour, and the final 3-page itemized invoice that Henderson had just handed me in the service corridor. The silence that fell over the room was absolute and suffocating. A vacuum of sound so intense that the only thing audible was the low, mechanical hum of the building's industrial HVAC system vibrating through the floorboards. I didn't look at the confused faces of the cousins or the judgmental glints in the eyes of Brooks's business associates. I kept my eyes fixed on the podium, a massive piece of carved mahogany that stood at the center of the dance floor, currently unoccupied and waiting. As I bypassed the main entrance where Brooks was still standing with his hand outstretched in a hollow gesture of welcome, I saw his expression shift from practiced charm to a jagged, bewildered fear. He adjusted his $185 tie clip, a nervous tick that betrayed his lack of substance, but I didn't stop to acknowledge him. I climbed the 2 small steps to the podium, the silk of my dress catching on the wood, and I placed the manila folder down on the lectern with a sound that seemed to echo like a gavel in a courtroom. The 220 guests remained frozen, their forks halfway to their mouths, their $85 glasses of Veuve Clicquot shimmering in the candlelight like amber warnings. Standing there, looking out over the $9,000 worth of floral arrangements and the shimmering ice sculptures, I felt a strange, cold detachment. I looked toward the back of the room, past the investors and the Yale frat brothers, until I found table 22. My father, Silas, was leaning forward, his weathered face etched with a mixture of confusion and a protective instinct that transcended the social embarrassment Eleanor had tried to force upon him. He looked like the only real person in a room full of mannequins. I reached out and adjusted the microphone, the cold metal of the stand grounding me, and the slight screech of feedback pierced the air, making Eleanor Holloway wince and pull back as if the sound itself were a social faux pas. I wasn't the logistics manager anymore. I wasn't the bride who had spent $68,412 to be humiliated. I was a daughter who had finally calculated the true cost of her silence. The HVAC system hummed on, a steady, indifferent drone that reminded me of the machinery my father had tended for 25 years to make this moment possible. I opened the manila folder, the heavy cream cardstock of the final invoice catching the light of the spotlight, and I prepared to address the audience not as guests, but as witnesses to an audit. Brooks began to move toward the podium, his face a mottled purple, his voice a frantic whisper as he tried to call my name, but I raised my hand in a sharp, command-style gesture that stopped him in his tracks 10 feet away. The $12,000 Rolex on his wrist glinted, a symbol of everything he claimed to be and nothing he actually was. Now, let me take you back to the 12 minutes I spent in the bridal suite, where I realized that a man who contributes $0 to a partnership but expects 100% of the status is not a partner, but a predator. I looked down at the itemized bill, at the $1,200 floral arch and the $85 salmon, and I realized that every single person in this room was currently participating in the theft of my father's retirement. They were eating his overtime, drinking his night shifts, and sitting on the chairs he had paid for with his own physical health. I gripped the sides of the podium, the mahogany cool under my palms, and I cleared my throat, the sound amplified 100 times over by the Grand Majestic's high-end sound system. The lights were still dimmed, the atmosphere still technically that of a wedding, but as I looked out at the sea of expectant faces, I knew that the celebration was over and the reckoning had arrived. I wasn't going to cry, and I wasn't going to ask for their opinion. I was going to read them the numbers, because in my world, numbers are the only thing that cannot be faked with a $3,000 suit or a Yale degree. The $4,200 Vera Wang dress felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, a physical manifestation of the burden I had allowed my father to carry while I chased the hollow approval of the Holloway family. I looked at the 3 Yale brothers at table 1, the boys who had replaced my father for the sake of the flow of the room, and I felt a surge of adrenaline that was sharper than any champagne. I saw the way Eleanor was clutching her pearls, her eyes darting around the room to see if any of her social peers were recording this, and I realized that her greatest fear wasn't the loss of my happiness, but the loss of her curated image. But images are fragile things, and I had brought the hammer. The $68,412.30 was a debt of the heart, and tonight the interest was due in full. I leaned into the microphone, my breath hitching for only a second before my professional training took over. I thought of the shipping containers I had rerouted in the middle of the night, the millions of dollars in inventory I had protected from loss. And I realized that tonight, the most important inventory I had to protect was my father's dignity. The 220 guests were a captive audience to a truth they weren't prepared for, a truth that smelled of peppermint oil and refinery grease rather than expensive mints and condescension. I reached into the folder and pulled out the first page of the bank statements, the paper crisp and white against the dark wood of the podium, and I prepared to show the world the difference between a man who lives on credit and a man who lives on character. The grand entrance was supposed to be the beginning of a new life with Brooks Holloway, but as I stood there in the silence, I realized it was actually the grand exit from a life of pretense. I was standing at the podium not to give a toast, but to deliver a final report. The 1,100 square foot bungalow and the 2012 Red Wing boots were 1,000 times more luxurious than anything the Sterlings had to offer, because they were real, they were earned, and they were mine. I looked at the MC who was standing in the shadows with his mouth slightly open, and then I looked back at Brooks, whose kingly posture had completely collapsed into the slumped shoulders of a man caught in a lie. The HVAC system continued its steady industrial pulse, the heartbeat of a building that didn't care about social standing, only about the mechanics of reality. And the reality was that table 22 was the only table in the room that mattered, because it was the only one that wasn't a lie. I opened my mouth to speak, the first words already formed by the cold, logistical math of my heart, ready to dismantle the grand, majestic farce, one line item at a time. "Thank you all for coming to celebrate a transaction," I began, my voice echoing through the Grand Majestic's high-fidelity sound system with a clinical, icy precision that cut through the heavy, perfume-saturated air of the ballroom. I did not use the microphone for sentiment, nor did I use it to offer the tearful, poetic tribute that most brides give to their families. Instead, I used it to read numbers, the only language that the people in this room truly respected, and the only language that could not be manipulated by a $3,000 Oscar de la Renta suit. I stood at the mahogany podium, the glare of the spotlight reflecting off the ivory silk of my $4,200 gown, and I looked directly at the sea of Yale graduates and venture capitalists who had spent the evening basking in a luxury they assumed was their birthright. Table 1 was paid for by Silas Rhodes, a man who earned exactly $724,000 over 25 years of backbreaking physical labor at the refinery, I stated, my eyes locking onto Brooks's business partners as I watched their expressions of smug satisfaction dissolve into a confused, jarring silence. Brooks Holloway, the man standing over there in the $9,000 Breitling watch and the $185 silk tie clip, the man who drives a leased Porsche Cayenne that costs him $1,240 a month to maintain an illusion, contributed exactly $0.00 to this evening. The silence that followed was so profound that you could hear the individual clink of a server's tray in the distant kitchen and the steady, indifferent hum of the HVAC system as it pumped chilled air into a room that was suddenly becoming very, very hot for the Holloway family. I reached into the manila folder and pulled out a stack of 50 photocopied sets of the final itemized bill and the bank statements, and with a calculated logistical efficiency, I began passing them out to the front tables, watching as the $500 an hour lawyer I'd called earlier nodded from the sidelines. Brooks told me tonight that my father didn't fit the aesthetic of Table 1 because he looks like a janitor and smells like a basement, I continued, my voice gaining a resonant, rhythmic power as I watched the first few guests scan the 3-page document detailing the $68,412.30 cost of their Wagyu beef and Veuve Clicquot. Well, since my father is the one who wrote the check for every single flower, every crystal glass, and every $85 salmon entree in this building, he doesn't just belong at Table 1, he owns it. And since Brooks couldn't even find the funds to pay for the marriage license, preferring instead to spend his $120,000 salary on club memberships and status symbols, I've decided that I am not signing it. I saw Brooks's face turn a sickly, ashen shade of gray that perfectly matched the charcoal of his custom-tailored suit, his mouth hanging open in a silent, pathetic gasp as the realization hit him that his carefully constructed house of cards had just been hit by a Category 5 hurricane. His mother, Eleanor, who had been the architect of the flow of the room, froze in mid-motion, her hand trembling so violently that she dropped her silver fork onto the fine bone china with a sharp, piercing clink that sounded like a gunshot in the hushed ballroom. The 220 guests were no longer looking at the bride. They were looking at the 3-page autopsy of a social climber's lies, reading the line items for the $1,200 floral arch and the $9,000 flower budget that my father's sweat had financed. I watched as the frat brothers at Table 1 scrambled to look away, their Yale education suddenly providing no defense against the raw, unvarnished math of a refinery worker's sacrifice. I stepped down from the podium, the heavy tulle of my gown trailing behind me like a discarded skin, and I didn't spare a single glance for Brooks as he tried to stammer out an explanation that no one was listening to. I walked with a steady, purposeful gait across the expanse of the cream-colored Wilton carpet, moving past the ice sculptures and the shimmering centerpieces, straight toward the very back of the room where the industrial dishwasher roared behind the service doors. I arrived at Table 22, the table tucked away in the shadows next to the kitchen entrance, and I reached down to take my father's hand. His skin was still warm with the scent of peppermint oil and the metallic tang of his honest life, and as his fingers closed around mine, I felt a sense of peace that $68,000 could never buy. "Dad, we're leaving," I said, my voice clear and loud enough to carry to the front of the room where the Sterlings stood in the wreckage of their reputation. "We've got $68,000 worth of steak and $85 champagne to pack into to-go boxes, and I think the people in this kitchen deserve a raise that Brooks's investors will never give them." My father looked at me, his eyes searching mine, and for the first time that night, the weight on his shoulders seemed to evaporate, replaced by a fierce, quiet pride that made him look taller than any man at the head table. He stood up, his 2012 Red Wing boots planting firmly on the floor, and he didn't look back at the ballroom. He looked at me. Behind us, the chaos was beginning to erupt as the realization set in that the party was over before the first dance had even begun. I saw Henderson, the banquet manager, already signaling the staff to bring out the containers, his respect for my American Express gold card far outweighing his loyalty to the Holloway's empty prestige. We walked through those heavy oak doors together, the bride in her $4,200 gown and the refinery worker in his off-the-rack suit, leaving behind a room full of people who knew the price of everything and the value of nothing. Now, let me take you back to the moment I realized that family isn't a seating chart or a bloodline that grants you access to Soho House. Family is the person who works the 14-hour shift, so you never have to feel small. My father had spent $724,000 worth of his life to give me a dream, and I had used the last $68,412 of it to buy my freedom from a man who would have spent our entire future on a lease. As we stepped into the cool, rain-scented night air of Chicago, leaving the Grand Majestic Hotel in our rearview mirror, I realized that the logistics of my life had finally been sorted. I was no longer the head of logistics managing international shipping. I was a daughter who had successfully rerouted her soul. We didn't need the $9,000 watch or the $1,240 car payment to feel like we had won. We had the manila folder, we had each other, and we had the dignity that comes from knowing exactly who paid for the table. As we walked toward his old 1998 Ford F-150 parked in the back lot, the engine turning over with a familiar rhythmic rumble, I felt the wind catch the silk of the dress I would never wear again. Brooks would spend the next year trying to explain this night to his partners and his mother, but I would spend it building a life that didn't require an itemized bill to prove its worth. The 220 guests would tell the story of the bride who walked out for years to come. But the only part of the story that mattered to me was the feeling of my father's hand in mine as we drove away from the lights of the city. Family isn't who you're told to sit with. Family is who stays with you when you realize the table was a lie. I am Cassidy Rhodes, and as I sat in the passenger seat of that old truck, surrounded by the scent of peppermint oil and the silence of a job well done, I knew that I had finally found the only seat that ever mattered. The $68,412.30 was a staggering amount of money, a lifetime of toil and grit. But as a logistics expert, I knew that the return on investment for this night was infinite. I had traded a marriage to a $0 man for a lifetime of respect for the man who had given me everything. The Sterlings and the Holloways could keep their Breitlings and their Oscar de la Renta suits, and they could keep the hollow flow of the room that they so desperately guarded. My father and I were heading back to a 1,100-square-foot bungalow where the coffee is strong, the boots are old, and the value of a person is measured in the strength of their word rather than the brand of their tie clip. The audit was complete, the bill was settled, and for the first time in my 30 years, the ledger of my life was perfectly balanced. We drove through the streets of Chicago, the city lights blurring into a golden haze, and I realized that the best part of the $68,000 wedding wasn't the party. It was the moment I realized I didn't need it. I was home. By exactly 9:30 p.m., the adrenaline that had fueled my walk across the grand majestic ballroom had finally begun to settle into a deep, resonant sense of peace as I stepped through the threshold of my own apartment, a space that felt infinitely more grand than any hotel suite because it was filled with the truth. The air in my living room was still and cool, smelling of the lavender diffuser I had set before leaving for what was supposed to be my wedding, a scent that now felt like a cleansing ritual for the life I had just discarded. I didn't even take off my coat before I walked to my mahogany desk, opened my laptop, and began the final logistical maneuver of the evening with the same cold efficiency I use to reroute global cargo fleets. I drafted one final email to Brooks Holloway, ensuring that I carbon-copied both Eleanor and the elder Brooks Sterling II, and I attached a crisp, high-resolution PDF of the $15,000 cancellation and damages fee that the Grand Majestic had just issued. Because I had officially withdrawn my American Express Gold Card as the primary guarantee for any incidental costs or post-event liabilities, the hotel's automated system had immediately pivoted the remaining debt to the secondary card on file, the one Brooks used for his $1,240 monthly Porsche payments. I watched the progress bar as the email sent, a digital guillotine falling on the neck of his pretension, and then I performed the most satisfying action of the night by selecting his contact and clicking the block button, effectively erasing his ability to ever again whisper about the flow of a room into my ear. I set the phone down on the granite countertop and walked to the refrigerator, bypassing the expensive wine rack to pull out a simple, chilled $4 bottle of Fiji water. And as I took the first sip, I felt a wealth that had nothing to do with the $120,000 salary Brooks boasted about or the $3,000 suits his mother wore. I felt rich because my integrity was no longer for sale, and the $68,412.30 lesson my father had paid for had finally been learned in full. I walked back into the living room where the soft, amber light of my floor lamp cast long, gentle shadows across the hardwood, and I saw my father, Silas, sitting on the edge of my gray linen sofa, his large frame finally relaxing after a decade of standing guard over my future. He was leaning forward, his hands still smelling faintly of the peppermint oil he used for his joints, and he was finally unlacing those heavy, mahogany-colored Red Wing boots he had bought in 2012, the boots that had walked the refinery floors so I could walk the halls of power. The sound of the heavy leather hitting the floor was a more beautiful symphony than anything the $2,500 wedding band had played earlier that evening. I sat down on the floor near his feet, the $4,200 Vera Wang gown, now nothing more than a pile of expensive fabric that I would likely donate to a charity for underprivileged students. And I watched as he rubbed his tired feet, his face finally free of the mask of shame that Eleanor Holloway had tried to force upon him. We were surrounded by the quiet of a Saturday night in a city that was still moving outside our window. But inside this apartment, time had slowed down to the only rhythm that mattered, the rhythm of a father and daughter who had survived a merger that was actually a hostile takeover. Now, let me take you back to the moment I saw him at table 22, looking like a ghost in the machine of his own generosity, and realize that the $15,000 cancellation fee was the cheapest price I could have paid to ensure he never felt like a janitor in his own life again. Brooks would likely spend the next several weeks dealing with the fallout of the itemized bills I had distributed, his $9,000 Breitling watch perhaps being the first thing he would have to sell to cover the cost of the Wagyu beef and the champagne that he had invited his Yale brothers to drink on my father's dime. But as I sat there in the silence, drinking my $4 water, I didn't feel a shred of malice or a need for further revenge. I felt a profound sense of relief that the logistics of my heart had finally been sorted into the correct columns. I looked at my father, who was now leaning back against the cushions, his eyes closed as he breathed in the quiet air of a home that was bought with honest work and maintained with genuine love. He didn't ask me about the $68,000, and he didn't ask me about the embarrassment of the walkout. He just reached out a hand and rested it on my shoulder, his rough, calloused palm a reminder of where I came from and what I was truly worth. I thought about the 1,100-square-foot bungalow where he still lived, the house that had been the laboratory for his sacrifice, and I realized that he was the most successful man I had ever met. Not because of his bank balance, but because he had the strength to be invisible so that I could be seen. The $120,000 salary Brooks earned was a hollow number compared to the $724,000 my father had earned over 25 years of labor, because every cent of my father's money had a purpose and a soul attached to it. Every $31.50 an hour had been a brick in the wall of my protection, while every dollar Brooks spent was just a coat of paint on a crumbling structure. The transition from the Grand Majestic's marble halls to the simple comfort of my living room was the most important journey of my life, a movement from a world of leases and social aesthetics to a world of ownership and authentic presence. By 10 p.m., the silence in the apartment was a living thing, a warm blanket that covered the jagged edges of the day's betrayals. I knew that tomorrow would bring a flurry of logistics, returning the unused items, finalizing the legal separation of our assets through Marcus Thorne, and perhaps helping my father find a better investment for the remaining funds in the Vanguard account. But for tonight, the only task was to be a daughter again. I looked at the manila folder resting on the coffee table, the document that had served as the instrument of my liberation, and I realized that the real moral of this story wasn't about the money or the wedding or the $185 tie clip. It was about the fact that family is the person who stays with you when the music stops and the lights come up, and dignity is the only thing you can't buy with a 20% down payment. My father finally opened his eyes and looked at me. a small, tired smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You did good, Cassie," he whispered, his voice thick with the exhaustion of a man who had finally finished a 30-year shift. I leaned my head against his knee, the silk of the dress feeling cold while his presence felt like a furnace of steady, unchanging warmth. The $15,000 fee was a small price for the silence of this moment, a silence that wasn't filled with the hum of an industrial HVAC system or the clinking of crystal, but with the heartbeat of a family that had finally stood up for itself. I am Cassidy Rhodes, and as I sat on the floor of my apartment with my barefoot father, I realized that I had finally successfully managed the most important shipment of my career. I had delivered my soul back to the man who had actually paid for it. The Holloways and their Yale degrees and their champagne-colored suits were now just a distant noise, a fading echo of a world that I no longer needed to belong to. I was the daughter of Silas Rhodes, a man who smelled like peppermint and looked like a hero, and as we sat there in the soft light of the living room, I knew that the finish line wasn't the altar at the Grand Majestic. The finish line was right here, in a room where the boots were off, the water was cheap, and the love was the only thing that wasn't itemized on a 3-page bill. The weight of the $4,200 gown was no longer a burden, because I was already mentally unzipping it, ready to step back into the world as the woman my father had raised me to be, strong, honest, and completely aware of the value of a day's work. The night was ending not with a dance, but with a deep, cleansing breath, a realization that the most beautiful thing about the $68,000 wedding was the moment I realized I was worth more than the sum of its parts. We didn't need the to-go boxes of steak or the vintage champagne to feel full. We were full because we were together, and because for the first time in 30 years, the seating chart was exactly where it needed to be. I was at the head of my own life. My father was by my side, and the toxic influence of the $0 man had been rerouted to a destination where I would never have to find it again. This was the end of the transaction and the beginning of the rest of my life, a life built on the solid ground of a 31.50 hourly wage and the indestructible bond of a father who never, ever stopped showing up.